staff. So we're lucky enough to be joined by 3 fantastic speakers today. Each of them will be speaking for 10 minutes from a slightly different perspective on this topic. And then for the second half hour, it will really be kind of an open discussion. So I want you all to be thinking about your kind of individual biggest challenge when it comes to this topic. And we'll open the floor up afterwards for a little Q&A or kind of open discussion involving everyone. So yeah, it'd be really good to hear kind of everyone's experiences, insights, challenges, successes as well. So to start with, we've got Kevin, who will be speaking. He is the co-founder of Catalyst, a company founded relatively recently, 2016, I believe, and grown pretty rapidly to a sort of 185 employees, around about that?
115. 185 sounds good.
Yeah, we'll give you that. We'll give you that.
200.
And Catalyst have consistently been voted in in a couple of lists on best places to work in New York. So obviously, have really kind of cracked a great company culture, and it'd be great to hear how you've sort of addressed that from day one and continue to maintain that through. So, Kevin, please feel free to take it away.
Yeah. Should I just go on a spiel for 10 minutes?
Yeah, 10 minutes.
So I started the company in basically end of 2016, 2017, and started with my older brother, Edward, who's typically here, but if he's not available, they'll reach out to younger brother and see if he's available. So you're stuck with me today. And the first year and a half of the business was an absolute shit show. Like, we raised $2.5 million in 30 days. We were like on top of the world. I remember we were on like in SF on like the hill where like all the VCs are. And we were like, you know, he was like kind of crying. I was like laughing, and I was like, you know, we're like, fuck yeah, like we're gonna be the next Uber, Facebook. And my God, the next year and a half was just brutal. It was basically, if you've seen Silicon Valley on HBO, it's basically that for like a year and a half, just absolute joke. Code was bad, culture sucked, nothing worked. I told Edward I was gonna quit every day. I was like, you know, this is kind of recorded, so I'm like thinking of what to say. I was like, basically, if we don't get rid of these people, I'm gonna quit. And he's like, no, we need them so bad. Like, we can't get to the next step of the business. What do you mean we need them so bad? We're not doing anything. Like, we're literally just sitting here arguing. The product doesn't work. And what does that mean? It is all about the culture. Like, if you're gonna work your ass off and do all this stuff, in the startup days, it's life or death, especially in the early phase. Like, we're all about work-life balance now, and don't get me wrong, there is such hard days, hard weeks, but in the early days, there is no work-life balance. Like, I'm sure earlier founder you are, no funding, bootstrap, like you're gonna feel that. So it's just about the people that you're spending time with is so critical. So we went from 2 to 11 people, back down to 3, spent $1 million of the $2.5 million. We're like, oh, you know, there it goes. And then so we started focusing on hiring the right people. And we were religious about hiring the right people. We were doing all sorts of crazy things, back channels, you know, it's like not a best practice if you don't do it correctly, but we wanted to make sure that we were gonna get the people who were going to align with our culture and also add to the culture. It's a big concept that we have here at Catalyst is like, it's not about culture fit, it's about culture add. You don't wanna just get 100 people just like you, but in the early days, we kind of did get a lot of people like me and Edward who were very people first at the end of the day, and it was about that. Because it's gonna feel like a family in the early days to get to the next stage. And so we hired a great head of product, and that head of product found us our head of engineering. That head of engineering brought in their engineers, and it worked out really well. And then one of the, I hate the word game changing, but I haven't finished this yet, so I don't know of any other word, but one of the most like game changing or pivotal moments in our kind of inception of Catalyst was when we brought on our now VP of people, or she was always basically our VP of people, Jessica. So we worked with her at a company called DigitalOcean, and she brought a lot of expertise in just human resources, people development, coaching, managing up. Like, most companies don't bring on a role like that till they're 150 employees. That was our 18th employee. Very, very early on. And it was intentional because I used to, even at maybe 10 employees or before we started Catalyst, I would read Glassdoor's obsessively reviews of all the companies that didn't work out. So if you look at top 20 New York City tech companies that essentially flopped, I've read through every single one of their Glassdoor reviews. And what it always boiled down to was lack of transparency, no direction, leadership, not diverse, not hiring the right people, poor product direction. But what was the kind of denominator of all of those things? It was the people that you hire, the lack of alignment, the lack of culture, the lack of consistency, lack of communication. So I became obsessed with a people-first culture. And Jessica, our VP of People, brought on just so many best practices. Like at 50 employees, so just to give you some context, we started off with obviously just 2 founders in 2017. We scaled to now 115 employees. We're on all the top best places to work. A fun stat that I like to coin to just even people that I'm trying to recruit is we have almost 50 plus reviews now on Glassdoor, and they're all 5 stars. And we're not paying anybody to write those. They're truly organic and generic. My co-founder and CEO responds to every single review. There's not a lot of CEOs at Series B going on C stage companies that are responding to reviews themselves, but that is intentional because we put our people front and center. At the end of the day, if you don't have, people spend so much time on trying to acquire new customers and retain them, but if you don't have great employees and you're not retaining and growing them and they leave, what else do you have? You don't have, the cost of rehiring, retraining your top tier talent, that's a brutal experience if you have to go through that. So there's nothing more important to that. And at 50 employees, I always ask people this, I'll just ask the crowd to take a few guesses. At 50 people, at about 50 with, let's say, 10 million in funding, not that funding matters, but it gives you kind of stage where we were at and the resources that we have. How many people do you all think that we had on our people and HR team? I'll just take a few guesses from the crowd. And you can't answer because you work there. 4, 3, 0. 2. We had 6.
Oh.
That is a big, big team. So it's not just recruiting. That is a big component. It's employee experience. We had a dedicated person just thinking about employee experience, sending employees gifts, remembering their anniversaries, taking care of the office. We didn't just have a dedicated office manager. It was very intentional with everything that we were doing. We had people thinking about fair equity plans, making sure a female engineer was not getting less equity or base than a male engineer with the same amount of experience. That is a real thing, right? Have you read the Carta kind of press, right? It's you don't want to end up in that situation, and that is the type of era that we are in. Those companies do get put on blast because it's just been kind of covered up for the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And things like bi-directional feedback, first-time manager training, 360 reviews, all of those things is what has helped Catalyst have great employee retention. And that's not saying that because I'm a biased founder, it's literally in our stats. So one of our investors is Excel, so they've invested in Slack, Facebook, DocuSign, Qualtrics. And out of every single stage of companies that they have, Series A, Series B, Series C, Series D, Series E, public, or not public anymore because they liquidate their shares, but they said Catalyst has the best employee retention out of all of their companies. So it's just, you have to care a lot about it. And yeah, it's you also got to dedicate the resource, time, and money to it because it's not it's the same amount of effort as it takes to build out a sales team, if not more. So I know we're coming up on time.
Thank you, Kevin.
The 10 minutes blows by fast, wow.
Really appreciate that. Really insightful, really interesting. Up next, we've got Zehra. Zehra, for context, was one of the early employees from Republic. So she joined when it was a seed stage company, and they're now Series B with 500 plus employees. So I think it'd be really interesting to hear kind of from that employee perspective, what should companies be doing to attract that talent, and why Zehra stayed at Republic and not left and gone to the next company. So Zehra, please. Take it away.
Yeah, for sure. Hi, everyone. Really nice to meet you. I know that says investment associate, but a great example of Republic is I was just promoted, so it's now senior investment associate. But I did start as an intern, and I interned at Republic for a year and basically graduated, started full time, and was given a lot of responsibility. So we'll kind of set the scene for, I think, like the first 30% of this 10 minutes, and then we'll kind of, I think, give tips from the employee perspective of how Republic has retained employees, what the company culture looks like, and how we've maintained, I think, just having people who have been around since the company was founded 2016. Almost every single early employee at Republic has stayed there. So it's definitely a really compelling culture, to say the least. But just to kind of start it with my own journey, Republic was a seed stage company when I joined. We had just acquired another version of what we do. We're an investment platform that basically democratizes access to investing for both accredited and non-accredited investors. So think of us like AngelList, but for everyone. AngelList is actually our parent company, so I think some of our culture came from them. But I joined as an intern. I was given a lot of responsibility. We were still like 50 people at that point, but I was able to develop a program, pitch it to our CEO. He gave me the go-ahead to do it, and I ran it. I got us like, I think 3,000 different applicants for founders who were interested in Republic, took off all these marketing initiatives, and I was still in school. And there were people there who had been bankers, VCs, and private equity, and they were sitting in the room listening to my ideas and my plans because they knew that I was the person who was here developing this program, showing the results, proving that the numbers are there and there's interest. So I think just as a base layer, my experience as an intern was very rare as compared to what we see at bigger corporations or even other startups. Interns typically aren't given that much responsibility to literally create like something from scratch, pitch it to the CEO at that point, and then like work with them really closely on it. So I feel like that first was a really good indicator to me that Republic actually valued my opinion, even as like a junior intern at that point. Basically came on full-time, switched teams, and I think a huge motivating factor for me there was Republic employs people all across the globe. No matter like what age you're at, if you prove yourself, then you're going to be rewarded with, I think, what Republic sees as proportional to the revenue you're driving. If you can say, hey, I brought in these like 200 new customers and this is the revenue that's projected, and then it amounts to that, Republic's going to reward you. So my experience has always been that when I did the work, I would get rewarded, and there was no idea that, okay, just because she's a fresh grad, she has to be in this position for 2 years and then she'll like transition. If I showed the results, I was going to get promoted. We have directors at Republic who are like 22 who have proven themselves, and that's why they got to that point. And we have directors who are also like 35, 34 who have extremely big age gaps with the other directors, but there's just respect across the board. So that's what my experience has been like. I think that the reason Republic was able to accomplish this is due to 5 big differentiators. I work with founders all day. I hear about their teams as well. We are like a founder-facing company. And I think what Republic does that retained all these employees was first, just like maintaining startup culture even though we're at 500 employees. Anyone at any point at Republic can either like Slack our CEO, maybe it'll take him like a few hours to respond to it, but he always gets back to everyone. And there's an openness, like what you said about transparency. We can ask him any questions we want and he's gonna answer us. There's no hierarchy or level of like, you have to be a director to get this amount of information. Everyone is kind of like across the board able to get info about Republic that they want to kind of get more of a, I'd say, better understanding about. The second point is that Republic really values diversity, and it's not just diversity in the way that people kind of, I'd say, think about it now, where you have to have like a certain quota met or you need to make sure that you have representation across the board. It's really about the fact that they, from the ground up, we're hiring the best of the best, and diversity was a priority, but it was always about making sure that there was diversity in thought amongst all the different arms of the business. So in saying that, we have I think more female employees than male employees at this point. We have people of color across the board at Republic. We have a lot of Black, Brown, Latinx, Indigenous employees, which a lot of other tech companies don't at that point. Our entire sales team is built up of people of color, men, women, and across the board, just people coming from different identities. And I think it's really hard to scale that because when we did have a VP of people join us, then some systems were put in place where it wasn't always the managing director who was making the employing decisions. It was always going to be maybe the VP of people or the HR team. But our CEO made sure that diversity was a priority. So when we were looking at applications and looking at resumes, we were making sure that we were prioritizing giving everyone a fair shot and making sure that we were looking across the board at like what the metrics look like. If we hired 50 new employees, what did that breakdown look like? Where could we have improved? So I think diversity and staying true to that was the second point. The third point to Republic is, I think, a huge part of just our success at as a company is that we really also prioritize proving yourself with numbers. So I think that sounds really like, what does that actually mean? I think everyone knows that numbers matter, numbers are important, revenue is important, all of that. But if you have any idea and you can showcase that it led to this point of growth in whatever metric you're using as your OKR, almost always you're going to be given the authority to go ahead, drive that project. If it doesn't work out, that's fine. If it does work out, then you're able to continue to drive it, lead it, potentially have a new title change. Think about siloing yourself into your own like new arm of the business. Every single person who's been in my position basically carved out a new role for themselves and became a director, a managing director, an executive VP at Republic over the last 6 years. So we really prioritize, I'd say, just like proving all your plans with points of growth and numbers to prove that what you're doing actually amounts to something. I think the fourth point is that managers are always expected to ask their employees, whoever is on their team, how do you feel about the way I'm managing you? Because I think there's an expectation that we have to kind of adapt to whatever the manager's like managerial style is. If they like getting messages in the morning, you message them in the morning, and it's almost like you have to adapt, at least from what I've heard at other companies. But at Republic, the managers ask the employees, how do you like to be managed? What does that look like for you? When do you like working? We're a very flexible company. And so I think them being forced to ask that question also allows the managers to check themselves and say, hey, am I being my best self right now being a manager? Am I actually giving them the tools that they need to succeed in whatever projects that they're doing for this quarter or the OKRs that they have to meet? So that's a question that all of our managers just like straight up have to ask, and it becomes an HR problem if it's not asked and it's not brought up every quarter during like quarterly reviews, half-year reviews. So that is a really specific point, but I highly recommend training your managers to be very employee first, because I think that's the reason most of the managers at Republic are so successful and they continue scaling, because their teams deliver because they know how to manage each person and adapt to their style. So Republic does have that mentality where it's almost like a top-down approach as opposed to like, I guess, the manager really dictating what their relationship should be with the employees. So we do have a lot of power there, where I think in most companies that are scaling up from 15 employees, 50, 100, that sometimes gets lost in translation. I'd say the fifth point is anytime we hired someone extremely executive, and I know startups get to, I'd say like maybe Series A, Series B point, where you might bring in someone who has like 20 years experience in an industry. Republic always hired the executives who had relevant experience and came with a plan to say, I don't want to shake up the culture that's already here. I'm not bringing in my hierarchy from like Evercore, or I'm not bringing in the hierarchy from Morgan Stanley. Rather, I'm going to adapt to Republic, bring my like 30 years of experience, but make sure that it fits the framework. So every single of the like 5 really executive employees that we hired this past year during our Series B, each of them came to Republic and presented at an all-company meeting, this is how I'm fitting into Republic, not this is what I'm changing. And all of these people, some of them led the acquisition of Smith & Barney with Morgan Stanley. One of them scaled Evercore from 10 employees to like the thousands that they have now. So these are all really executive people, and instead of coming in being like, this is my way and we're all gonna adapt to it, they came in with the mentality that Republic has this structure, this is what I see, this is how I'm fitting into it, as to not disrupt the culture that has been created. So from an employee point of view, I was there when we were 50 people. We're about to finish an acquisition and be at 600 employees. So I think this is a really good way that those 5 points are a really good way that Republic has retained all those employees. And I think it's the best way to grow, just making sure you're transparent, open. The CEO might not always have the time, but makes times for the employees, and making sure that managers are well equipped to understand how to best serve their group and their team.
Fantastic. Really interesting. Thank you, Zehra. And then last but not least, we have Avi, current founder of Showed Me, a startup, scaling startup, but previously held director management roles for kind of HR and people at some big corporations. So it'd be really good to hear from you, Avi, and kind of understand what you've you know, the process you had in place at the big corporations and what you've kind of drawn through to your startup now.
Sure, yeah. Oh, first of all, good morning, everyone. And thanks, Will, for inviting me to this. I think what you've heard from Kevin and Zehra, is it Zehra? Yeah. Is, again, it's a very, very, very thoughtful process, right? It's a very conscious process, building a culture. It doesn't happen as naturally as people sometimes assume it happens. So I'll give you a little bit of my background and sort of how I learned to build cultures in growing organizations. I actually started out not far from here in Chelsea on 8th and 16th. I worked at DoubleClick. And at 25 years old, I got hired to help DoubleClick grow from 700 employees to 1,500 employees in about 2.5 years. And they were very open about it when I got there. They said, you got to figure this out. And you know, about 2004, 2005. And the first thing I said is, well, we can't hire all those people if we can't retain a lot of people. We had a lot of turnover, probably 20, 25% turnover. So I said, we've got to figure this out, right? How are we going to get people to stay here? Because if we hire people, but the people keep leaving, this isn't going to work. And I spent the next few years, you know, figuring that out. And eventually we grew to about 1,500 people globally, and we were sold to Google. Many people did well. I didn't, but that was fine. But what was nice was I got the opportunity to try it again, right? Those things that I had learned over those few years. There was a company, JMI Equity, if any of you are familiar with them, a private equity firm. And they took me to another company that they had in their portfolio, a company called Undertone, which had about 75 employees at the time, but also wanted to go through similar growth. And I remember I met with the new CFO they had brought in from IBM, and he said, when do people usually bring like an HR guy like you to help the company grow? We only have 75 employees. And I said, yeah, it's usually a lot more. So his vote was no. But the CEO and JMI were on board, so they forced me in the door. And I got to do the same thing again. So we went from 75 to 350 employees over a few years, and eventually sold the business as well. And now I run a very boring company in the online healthcare compliance business. If I have time, I'll get to that. But what I learned in those experiences, I think again, if you're a founder, if you're part of a founding team, or if you're a CEO of a scaling company, I think there's 4 fundamental things you need to think about. And I tell this, I've helped a lot of organizations from a consulting standpoint in the last 10 years go through these kind of growth stages. And I think you need to be, you know, we use the word genuine a lot, right? You need to be genuine, right? But who cares, right? That's like using the word strategic. Yeah, we have to be genuinely strategic, right? But I think you have to be genuine in four key areas, I think, for your company to be able to scale. And if you can't, you need to be honest with yourself and maybe get someone else to do that, right? And those 4 key areas, I think, are number 1, you have to be genuinely passionate about your industry, right? You can't build a great culture if you don't really care that much about the industry that you're in. And it's weird sometimes because I was in ad tech for 10 years and everyone hates ad tech, right? Because they're just serving up these ads and they're constantly chasing around the internet trying to sell you shoes that you already decided you don't want to buy, but now they still want you to buy them, right? But I loved ad tech. That's what I decided. I said, I'm going to love ad tech, and I loved it. And I remember even I had little kids, and I remember they would, you know, we bought YouTube back in 2006, and they would watch, you know, YouTube. We used to watch YouTube, and then they had those you know, ads that would start running before YouTube, and they hated those. They're like, oh, why do you have to sit through this 30-second ad? I was like, hey, that pays the mortgage, right? You just click on it. Just click on it, right? So you have to love your industry. And I would literally, to the point where, you know, salespeople would come, I was in HR, but salespeople would come over and say, you want to work on our team? Because you really love this industry. Like, you could sell this. I'm like, yeah, but that's what I do in HR. So I think that's number 1. The second thing is your product, right? I meet a lot of founders, and sometimes I hear that sort of wavering in their voices, whether they're really passionate about their product, right? You have to be passionate about your product, right? You have to love it. Employees can tell. When you get up in front of employees and say, this is what we're doing. Or, you know, I went through a pivot at Showed Me. And I had to get up to my employees and say, I'm passionate about our product, I'm passionate about this pivot, and they have to believe me, right, in order for this to work. So I was, you know, you have to be genuine about your product and really believe in it. And like I said, too many founders have sort of built things so they thought they were a good idea, right? Sometimes founders are very, they're sort of genuine about being a startup, but not really the product, right? So you have to be. And again, if you're not, hire head of product, hire somebody else who can be super passionate about that. So those are the first 2. The third one is people, right? If you don't like people, then you probably do like people, but you still have, then you have to hire somebody. Like the VP of people is actually interesting to me. I don't know if I was the first, but there were 2 titles that I took early on, and I kind of thought at the time, based on LinkedIn back then, that I may have been one of the first people to use those titles because I really thought about it. So when I joined DoubleClick, they said, what do you want your title to be? And I said, well, this is great. I get to pick my title. And they said, yes, you get any title. And I said, what title is going to resonate with people? Right? Like, I was an HR person, right? And it's like, you know, the HR guy, you know. So they said, what do you want to be? I said, I want to be the employee development manager. And they're like, okay, it's a weird title, but why? I said, because the people will come over to me. They'll say, you're the employee development manager, how do I grow? Right? And that's actually what would happen. Like people would come over and they'd say, well, you're the employee development manager? Yeah. Like, what is that? I'm like, I help people grow their careers. Like, fantastic, great, what do I do, right? That was my whole job there. And then years later when I became a VP, and I think it was in 2007, 2008, and they said, you're gonna be VP of HR. I said, nah, I can't be VP of HR. Right? It's in how you design your policies and procedures. I've tried a lot of stuff. By the way, unlimited PTO, don't do it. I tried that. Right? I was one, again, early on, I was early tech here. So I tried the unlimited PTO, it's a disaster, it doesn't work. But there's so many things that, again, if you really think about people and you're creating these policies, like you do them. I actually get into most trouble these days because I ignore the policies because I care about people. Like my employees will just call me up and say, hey, and share way too much information. Hey, I'm pregnant with twins. Like, oh, hey, what do you need, right? And then I'll tell them, yeah, you can have whatever you want. And then, HR will call, like, what are you doing? Don't promise things. And why are people telling you they're pregnant? They should tell HR first or their manager first. I'm like, I don't know, but that's it. You have to be passionate. Scaling and you're growing, you have to be passionate about marketing and finance and sales and a P&L statement and all those things because, again, it has to come across. You have to come across as caring about those things, whether it's internally to your employees, whether it's externally to investors, whether it's to customers and clients. They want to know, right, that you are genuinely passionate about a business, right? And like I said, I can be honest with myself and say, like, I don't love that part of the business so much, right? And I really early on hired, controllers and HR people and things like that because I don't like to do those things. Right? I just don't. I love all the other things so much. I'm never going to have time to worry about a 401k plan. Honestly, never, right? And I'm never going to have enough time to worry about, when our controller or VP of finance wants to come and discuss our P&L. I just don't care. I just don't, right? So you got to have the right people in there who they care, right? So I'm like, do you care about this? I'm like, absolutely. I have a controller who loves numbers. She just loves numbers. It's like the best thing in the world, right? And she gets up and she presents the organization. She's passionate about that. So I really think that, again, if you're serious about scale, right? If you seriously want to be that person who's going to scale your company, right? Then you have to think about those 4 categories and really think about, can I personally, right, be the person who's going to be passionate about those categories? And if not, like I said, just be honest with yourself and hire people who can be, right? Like I said before, I'm in the online healthcare compliance training business. We train people on HIPAA, OSHA, anti-harassment, the most boring things in the world. I don't know why I love it. I love healthcare. It's a broken system. Again, when you think about tech and I love broken, right? Who doesn't love broken? Healthcare is broken in America. Everyone knows that, so it's the best place to be. I love it. I love sitting down with heads of large healthcare organizations. Like, it's a disaster. Nothing works. We can't get anything. I'm like, great. This is the best. Like, what can you build? I don't know. I'll think about it, right? So you can be passionate about all kinds of interesting things. And I've helped other organizations who come to me and say, hey, we're 50, but we want to get to 500 or 600. And I tell them all exactly those things, right? I said, this isn't rocket science. You can go hire lots of consultants and everything like that. But just ask yourself those 4 important questions. If you get those right, and again, I was part of DoubleClick, it was an amazing culture. We joined Google. That was an incredible culture. I worked at Undertone. Best culture ever, right? And I'm trying to do the same thing with my organization by just being conscious. We're a small company, but just being conscious of those things. So yeah, that's, for me, like I try to keep things simple. Hopefully that's simple enough, but that's it. That's what I got.
Thank you, Avi. Appreciate all of the 3 guys for giving your insights from slightly different perspectives there.